Okay, welcome to our lunch debate today with Commissioner Vestager. It's a great pleasure and honor to welcome you today here at Bruegel, Commissioner. My name is Guntram Wolf. I'm the director of Bruegel, and I'm very pleased to host this debate in which we will discuss European competition policy and the energy transition. Now, there's many aspects playing into this. Energy union is one aspect. Energiewende, energy transition in different countries is another one. So we very much look forward to this debate. Commissioner Vestager is, of course, the European Commissioner for Competition Policy, for competition. She's been, prior to that position, minister in Denmark in different positions, including interior and also economy, and so has seen education also, has seen, let's say, I think politics from very different angles, and now in competition, of course, heading perhaps the most important field of the European Commission, certainly one of the most influential Commission areas where the Commission has executive powers. So we very much look forward to your presentation, followed then by a discussion moderated by our fellow Georg Zachmann, our expert for energy policy, and Carlos Sayé Alonso, Director of Energy Policy at Iberdrola, and Justus Haukapp, Director of the Düsseldorf Institute for Competition Economics. Okay, so without much further ado, many thanks for coming, and the floor is yours, Commissioner.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me here to Bruegel. Actually, it's still some, angst in me. Because I know you to be extremely good at what you do. We had the pleasure during the Danish presidency to ask Bruegel to produce a number of papers to initiate the debate at our informal ECOFIN, and it was very successful. So thank you very much for that. I think you have repeated it several times, but we sort of take the credit for enabling Bruegel to show its I think, enormous competence in a number of areas. Even the competence to produce short notes, which is lacking in some institutes. So thank you for that as well. I think that that this discussion today is extremely timely. You know that there are only few weeks till we see each other in Paris, only 1 week to the final negotiations in Bonn, and therefore to discuss how competition policy enables or disables, for that matter, if anyone holds that point of view, I think it is very timely. Enforcing EU competition law has very, very clear remit. We make sure that business practices and government subsidies do not tilt the playing field of Europe's single market. Any company can turn to us if they suspect that rival companies are not playing by the rule book or are themselves engaged in something that they shouldn't do and they want to come clear. We're not choosy in that matter. You can come to us at whatever reason. And then our decision will be based of the fact of the case. And the facts that we look at are not the size of the companies involved, the industry they're in, the nationality. These facts are immaterial. Every competition decision should confirm to everyone that this is a union of law, and that in Europe the law applies without distinction. But today I will argue that an even-handed application of EU competition law does facilitate the transition towards a decarbonized economy, which is one of our top goals in the Commission. In the transition to a green economy, our focus is to ensure that markets operate properly and that government support, including support to facilitate the drive towards renewable sources, does not create imbalances. We are naturally working a lot with the energy sector, but we are also working beyond energy in other green markets, such as recycling, and then I will touch upon that shortly. And when you hear that, you can relax, because then I will be at the end. But as I said, this is quite timely. I think you have found the right spot in the agenda, because going to Paris, well, this is an opportunity that we, and this is a we as we the world, should not be missing. We missed out in Copenhagen in 2009. I am optimistic that we can finally correct that mistake. And one of the reasons why I come with an optimistic mind is, of course, that now Europe is in the lead. The European Union is pressing for a global, fair, legally binding international treaty that can prevent global warming to reach dangerous levels. Now we're negotiating, and the EU comes with a very strong mandate. And I can praise that, because it was done by the previous Commission. It was a job well done to make the member states come together to give a very, very strong mandate for the Paris negotiation, to commit to a binding target reducing emissions by 40% in 2030 compared to 1999. Obviously, Europe cannot do this by ourselves, which is the reasons why we go to Paris. But we can lead by example, not only in setting goals, but also in figuring out how, both technology-wise, but also when it comes to support schemes. Some 40% of our carbon emission comes from industrial activity and transport, and almost 60% comes from fuels that we burn to generate electricity and heat. So obviously, one of the first challenges is to focus on the energy challenge. And what we have been doing is to put forward a far-reaching strategy. And I shall spare you for the details, but just give you the headlines. Because what we are proposing are measures to make energy supply more secure, to integrate national energy markets, to cut the demand for energy, decarbonize the energy mix, and to invest more in research and innovation. It is a very ambitious strategy, and it's building, of course, on what has been done previously, the third energy package, which we need to work. And it can only come true if the different departments of the European Union works very closely together. This is a strategy that in itself are tearing down silos in order to work in the same direction. And renewables are an obvious source of energy of the future. My portfolio, competition, is directly relevant to make sure that energy from renewable sources is brought to the market in a competitive manner, and that nothing hinders the development of an internal energy market. So just a few things that we can do to promote a low-carbon basket of energy sources and how competition policy can help. It is, you know, by heart and by the treaty for the individual member state to decide their energy mix. It's their own competence. That's the treaty.
It's not correct.
You can shout at me later. Over the past few years, of course, a number of governments have chosen to develop their renewable energy sources. And therefore, of course, there is progress. And that is within the present framework. Over the last 10 years, the amount of EU electricity mix from renewable sources has grown from just under 15% in 2004 to a little bit more than 25% 10 years later. And that is, I think, quite amazing, because this is without a new market model or the things that we're working with right now. Renewables has also become cheaper. Over the last 5 years, the average cost of onshore wind worldwide fell by 30%, and solar costs fell by 2/3. Prices are expected to fall even more. And that, as a result, one would think that governments would have a better deal. There is a but, though, because given the renewable boom, overall spending can increase, and there, of course, still take up a large proportion of public budgets. One of the tasks that I have is to make sure that subsidies are well designed, keep markets level, and address genuine market failures. Because as technologies mature, become cheaper, the case for government support is also weaker. That is a little haiku, and we try to do that to do outreach also to the more poetic people in the audience. In the past, basically subsidies were aiming at one goal: to maximize capacity for producing electricity from renewable sources. Very often, a single body would buy all the electricity generated in this way. But it was sheltering renewables from market forces. What we do now, instead, is to promote an approach where we want to integrate renewable sources into the markets and avoid to create new distortions. We have 3 ways to reach this goal. First, we encourage generators using renewables to do business like any other player. And from 2016, they will have to sell their electricity on the market. In addition, any support given should be given as a premium on top of market price. Second, we are trying to ensure that government support is cost-effective, financially sustainable, and to this end, from 2017, member states will have to grant operating aid through bidding processes. This is contrary to the present situation, where you very often find public administration to set prices. And now what we want to reach is that each company can make its bid on the basis of their own costs and the cost of the project. Finally, we want to get serious about a genuine European electricity market. We encourage member states to work with each other and to take into account the demand for electricity from across our national boundaries. And as we see it, this policy, which has been developed over years, is producing the first results. One concrete example is that in Germany, a recent tender of 400 megawatts of solar plants received 4 to 5 times as many bids as volume was auctioned. And the reference price for the winning bid was well below the administratively set price. Similarly, in the UK, different technologies with a similar degree of maturity, because that is, of course, one of the preconditions, have been put into competition with each other for aid, achieving a cost reduction of approximately 20% compared to the premium cap set again by administrative authorities. So far, so good. The thing is that when it works, it creates new problems, because renewables, they would create their own challenges for grid operators, because they do not necessarily produce consistent levels of powers. But with one problem solved, we are ready for the next one. And what member states do to tackle this, I'll come back to, but what I think is very important is that we tear down technical and regulatory barriers that keeps European markets fragmented. Because it is the fragmentation that gives the worry that power will not be sufficient. If we had a single European-wide market for electricity, well, the wind turbines of the North Sea could offset a cloudy day over a solar plant in Sicily. This is not the case now, unfortunately. and to address the issue of intermittent renewables and security of supply, it may be necessary to keep enough conventional plants ready as a backup. Heavy-duty gas turbines are among the best technologies here because, compared to other fossils, they are the most environmentally friendly and can be switched on quickly. It is mostly gas-fired plants that step in if in the breach and make sure that the lights doesn't go out. Just let me open an aside here, because we have been working with this in another area of my portfolio, which is in mergers. You know, we passed the merger of General Electric and Alstom not long ago. One of the concerns that we had was that the company that would emerge would have little or no interest in the Alstom gas turbine technology, which is cutting edge, absolutely state of the art. Nothing wrong with that, not at all. On the contrary. And we eventually cleared the deal, but only after the company pledged to sell a strategic part of the Alstom heavy-duty gas turbines to Ansaldo, an Italian firm. And the idea of that is, of course, that an important technology for Europeans' energy needs was in danger, and we managed to give it a fair fighting chance on the markets. Now, of course, it has to show itself as a viable competitor, but with the remedies in the clearance of the merger, at least there is a fighting chance for competition to make sure that choices can still be made for a European technology, in my opinion, very important for the green agenda. The thing is that even though you don't need one of those every day, they have a size, I don't know what colors they come in, but probably you have to be responsible for heating up Cologne or something like that if you want to buy one of those. They are rather expensive. And the thing is that investors will have their costs covered only when they're in use. And that, of course, makes the investment climate very, very unsecure. And two things that doesn't rhyme is energy and unsecure investment climate, because these investments are huge. And when we have a more insecure climate, well, then fewer plants will be built. Even fewer are being planned. And we already see that. And that, of course, gives concern as to whether or not there is enough capacity in the future. Because if you see it right now, I think you would say that, yes, there is sufficient capacity. Problem is it flexible enough? And will it stay that way when we look forward? That's the tricky point. And I think it's legitimate to have these concerns for a member state. The thing is, of course, how to meet legitimate concerns. Because 1 in 2 member states now has a capacity mechanism in place or are planning to introduce one. And these are support schemes to guarantee that conventional plants stay open and will generate electricity when demand's peaking. These schemes, they are a motley crew. I can tell you that. There is a wide variety of them. They are very often poorly coordinated. They are a sign of a great amount of creativity in member states, which is, of course, good. But maybe it would be even better if it was coordinated. And these are the reasons why we have launched this fact-finding exercise, what we call a sector inquiry, in 11 EU countries to see how the capacity mechanisms are designed and how they're run. And we will publish the result as soon as early next year. What we need to make sure is that these measures do not end up distorting the markets and are not used to reintroduce subsidies for conventional fuels by the back door. Rather than building new plants or extending the life of older polluting plants, why not make price more reactive to costs so that users can cut consumption? Why not invest in energy storage or new connection between grids? If, at the end of the day, and it is getting dark, capacity mechanisms are still the best alternatives in the short term, well, then they should be tendered out in an open and transparent way in order to give the best deal also from a taxpayer point of view. To adapt to the future of energy in Europe, we also need electricity markets that works. Power exchanges that can foot the bill. That's, of course, not the only way of selling electricity, but it is an excellent platform to bring renewables to the market. And they can facilitate cross-border trade in electricity, and thus, of course, help to bring integration much closer. And what we are trying to do with from the competition portfolio is to make sure that these exchanges actually work as exchanges, that they are open and competitive. It would, of course, be a paradox if it was the exchanges of all players that re-erected the barriers that we are trying to break down. We've had to intervene in a few cases. Last year, Commission prohibited discriminatory practices by Opcom, the Romanian power exchange, and a market-sharing agreement between rival exchanges Nord Pool Spot and Apex Spot. At present, we are investigating the Bulgarian incumbent energy group, and I hope that setting up a liquid and viable power exchange will help our concerns to evaporate. Looking beyond electricity, and this is where you can breathe freely again, I am nearly done, is of course to look at the important green agenda as such. And also here we are trying to chip in. We are in the Commission currently preparing a strategy for the circular economy. It is an integrated approach of life cycle of materials and products that go into consumption. The key is to use market forces to promote the transition to a greener economy, to meet the needs of European citizens, of course also to build an economy that is sustainable. Just let me mention one investigation we have in Austria to make this point. Austria is on a very fine track here. They passed a law that obliged all producers of packing material or packaged goods to collect, to sort and to recycle their packaging once it becomes waste. This is a good thing. To meet this obligation, producers got together and they created an organization called ARA. However, the Commission's environmental department found that in the past, this organization has the highest prices for waste management services in Europe. And you probably all pay that kind of bill, so you know they don't come cheap anywhere. Now, ARA has a de facto monopoly of waste management services in Austria, and its infrastructure cannot be duplicated. This includes a collection bag system used by 1.4 million households. And this is the situation on ground. So it's not something that you just change from one week to the other because you get an idea. We have an ongoing antitrust procedure against the ARA. The allegation is that ARA has eliminated competition from the waste management market by refusing access to its household collection infrastructure. We call that foreclosure. In the meantime, things have changed. Since earlier this year, a new Austrian waste law requires a shared use of the collection infrastructure. Our investigation, combined with this new law, should help to make sure that prices for collecting waste will go down. And therefore, hopefully, what competition can ensure is that when it comes to waste management services, that prices go down and you still have innovation. Because even though some things are pretty straightforward, you still need an innovative approach to enable the circular economy actually to emerge. With recent reform, we have simplified and extended the possibilities for EU countries to grant aids to waste management, as well as for remediation of contaminated sites, energy efficiency projects, and for carbon capture and storage. The objective, of course, is to give a flexible framework for member states to not only fight climate change, but also to make the transition of their economies. The thing is that it's not in the rule book that you find the solution, it's in applying the rule book that you find it. When you implement on the ground, then you can make it happen. And therefore, of course, we are dealing with a number of cases concerning critical areas, including waste management, where the need for public support must be carefully balanced against the need to protect markets that are already open to competition. As I see it, to keep the playing field level can be a very good thing for the green agenda. And building a green economy for the future, it requires, one, that we use the technology that we have already, that we renew our way of organizing, and we keep promoting innovation and new ideas. Because we need to have everyone on board, and that includes, of course, the business community. As I see it, we cannot do that if we cannot make the markets work. A market-driven approach must be one of the main approaches. It is, as always, in Europe, within a democratically decided framework of the ups and downs. But when it comes to waste management services, renewable sources of energy, many other sectors, we need the market to work with us, otherwise we have no chance to do the right thing for the planet. To reach the ambitious targets that the European Union will bring to Paris, we need also to show that it's not only in the rhetorics and in the speeches, it's also on the ground. And therefore, of course, we have to mobilize as many policy areas as possible to reach this. It is here in Brussels, but it is everywhere in governments, in cities, in municipalities. We need people to come on board to see that they can chip in. I hope, after having extended your patience for way too long, that you agree that competition policy is one of them. Otherwise, I'd be more than happy to repeat the whole thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Vestager. I'll directly switch to Carlos. Let me put to see where the slides are here. Well, Carlos is an engineer by education, but he has worked with the network operator for a long time, and he has also worked as a consultant before he joined Iberdrola as a director for energy policy. So he should be very well versed to discuss on the energy policy implications of your speech.
Okay, good morning, everybody. And first of all, I would like to thank to Bruegel to the invitation that has made to me to participate in this forum. And congratulations for the very nice speech that the Commissioner Vestager has made, a very interesting presentation that I nearly share at 100%. We completely agree that competition is the best way to achieve efficiency, and all of us, institutions and agents, has to make effort to reinforce it. We are very pleased with the way that the Commission is dealing the complex problem that we have, and to transform our economy in a low carbon economy, maintaining security of supply and maintaining all the competitiveness. But task is enormous, and past mistakes could give us some advice for the future. For that reason, my speech tried to focus on the experience that we have had during the recent years, dealing with the so-called vicious circle that arises when political intervention produces inefficiency that could also generate some competition problems. I have selected five issues that I will try to briefly comment that. The first one is related with the asymmetries that in transparency obligations established in the different countries or sectors. We believe transparency is needed for competition, but in many cases it's also a potential cause of incorrect diagnosis, because criticism is focused on the most transparent countries or agents. At the same time, the number of academic studies carried out in a country is not necessarily a measure of its lack of competition. For instance, some years ago, a report on the performance of European wholesale electricity market was published, but the report only considered in their final conclusions 4 countries, because these were those where the consultant had access to public information. At the end, all competition problems were focused, obviously, in these 4 countries, curiously the ones that have more public information available. So there is a need to harmonize information that can be used to analyze competition issues in order to be able to compare all countries in a level playing field. The second issue has already been covered by the Commissioner and relates to security of supply and the interesting debate between energy-only markets and capacity remuneration mechanisms. I have to say that, at the first sight, energy-only markets should be the preferred option because theoretically, and I make emphasis in theoretically, in the absence of constraints, and I also make emphasis in absence, they will produce efficient dispatch and will give correct signal for operation and investment. But the problem is that the real world is full of constraints. Scarcity and high prices situations are needed by the energy-only market to be sustainable, but they are not in practice allowed by the administrations. In some cases, because they establish price caps reducing revenues, and in other cases, because on the sake of maintaining a sufficient level of security of supply, more than the one that arises in the unrestricted energy-only market, they prevent an economic plans to close and leave the market. The high penetration of intermittent renewables, with reduced variable costs and lack of firmness, increase the volatility and the episodes of low energy prices when the sun, hydro or wind power production is high, and also the episodes of high prices when sun, hydro or wind are low. Firm capacity is needed for security of supply, in particular in transitional periods. But volatility increases the risk premium to invest and maintain firm capacity with few hours of operation, mainly if recovery of investment needs high prices in these few hours that are usually capped. Also, risk premium to invest could increase, and if an investor is looking that there are exit barriers that disallows to close a plant when there are long periods of low prices. Also, it's relevant to consider that the support given to security of supply by other countries depends on the interconnection level, and this could be very low in several countries. That is why capacity remuneration mechanisms are an option more compatible with the real situation that we have in Europe, and with more guarantees to achieve a predefined security of supply level, in particular in transitional periods, like the one that we are experiencing nowadays and that we will have in the future. CRMs are in fact part of a market design. If well defined, their revenues should not be considered as subsidies, but a remuneration for a service. They are not state aids. How should they be defined in order to become an efficient market tool? First, being transparent in order to everybody trust in the methodology. Second, they have to be designed under a wide, neutral, and not discriminatory approach. This means that service providers could be new and old agents, could be generators or consumers with demand response, or storage owners, or neighbor agents with interconnection use. Third, CRMs have to be market-oriented. And finally, it has to be a long-term approach in order to achieve an stability and to avoid uncertainties. The third source of problem arises when the interconnection capacity levels are insufficient. This situation is not only a security of supply issue, but a competition issue, due to the reduction of the relevant market faced by producers and consumers. It's an essential issue for achieving the energy union. It is clear that when a country has a low interconnection level, its competitiveness and the one of its national agents are reduced, regardless of their relative efficiency. For instance, high production excedence or surplus of low variable costs plus insufficient interconnection results in the spillage or curtailment of a very competitive generation. On the consumer side, the same thing happens when, in the other side of the interconnection, there is cheap energy available that cannot be transferred through the interconnection. A fourth problem comes from the different levels of taxes and additional charges included in the electricity tariffs. For instance, in many countries, several policy costs not related with electricity supply, related with social, regional, environmental, or industrial support, are included in the electricity tariffs. In fact, in some countries, these extra policy costs represent more than 50% of the total cost in final tariffs. Something similar happened with taxation. Some countries include taxes for generation or consumption that are very different from those faced by their counterparts in their neighbor countries. What are the problems derived from this situation? First, the lack of competitiveness induced in the European economy compared, for instance, with the economy sector from the United States, where electricity prices are about half of the European ones. There is also an artificial loss of competitiveness among producers and among consumers, not related to their particular efficiency, but resulting from the lack of harmonization of taxes and levies. Another problem derived from this bad allocation of costs in tariff or a non-harmonized taxation is the creation or development of inefficient business models supported by incorrect incentives, which in turn could be critical in transitional periods. Lack of harmonization of levies and taxes can also affect the cost-benefit analysis performed at the time of evaluating new interconnections. Last source of problems that I would like to mention is the way the internalization of environmental costs among agents is treated. It is partly related with the previous problem that I have described of costs included in electricity tariffs. The model signaled by the European Commission is that all costs should be internalized, aligning policies in the field of energy, economy, and environment. When allocating the cost of policies, it is important to use the polluter pays principle. To achieve this situation, a level playing field is required, and that means that, first, subsidies to emitters to be removed, and second, taxes and administrative costs to be reduced in the case of less emitters. Climate policy costs, for instance, costs or incentives to low-carbon technologies, are not just a responsibility of electricity consumers. The electricity sector has the best tools to fight against climate change, but this should not mean that all costs of this environmental policy have to be borne by electricity consumers. It is a national commitment and affect all citizens, so the first best solution to allocate costs should be public budgets, and second best should be to share the effort among all the energy consumers and not only electricity. The same thing happens with CO2. Electricity consumers are paying the cost of fighting against climate change through the CO2 price from the ETS that is passed through in the electricity price. Non-ETS sectors should face an equivalent cost signal in order to avoid distortion based on artificial competitive advantage. We can see in the slide an example of problems of competitiveness that arise due to the lack of correct sharing of environmental costs among different transport models, trains with electricity or trains with fossil supply. Fossil fuel trains enjoy an artificial competitive advantage with respect to electric trains. Electric trains have internalized through their electricity bills the cost of CO2 and the cost of other policies included in the electricity tariff, which are not related to electricity supply, for instance, incentives for low-carbon technologies. These costs are not included in its bills in the case of fossil fuel trains. The same thing happened with the lack of competitiveness of electric cars compared with fossil fuel cars. For that reason, it is crucial to remove from electricity price all those costs not related to supply and to establish a balanced and equitable share of environmental costs that will result in a level playing field across all technologies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlos. I give the floor to Justus Haukapp, who between 2006 and 2014 was the head of the German Monopolies Commission. So coming from more an engineer energy background to a more competition policy energy background.
Yeah, thank you very much for the two very inspiring presentations and talks. I would just want to comment on a few issues. First of all, I think it's very important that the European Commission is active in the field of competition policy in energy markets, because very often that is an aspect that is lost at the national level, where typically the Minister of Energy is not necessarily responsible for competition policy, and very often that's an angle or an aspect that's lost in energy policy. So it's even more important that the European Commission looks at energy markets from a competition policy perspective. And what worries me and what also worried us when I was still chairing the Monopolies Commission, that is that we see a disintegration or fragmentation of European electricity markets for quite some time now. We did a detailed analysis of price equality between different European markets, and especially since we had a huge increase in price equality in 2011, 2012, and since then, at least for Germany and its neighbors, we've seen decreasing times of price equality for a variety of reasons. And some of you who are closer to Germany may have seen that even a debate, I think, some weeks ago have started whether Germany and Austria should still be treated as one energy market, one electricity market, an electricity market that has been integrated for a very long time. And we have a debate whether Germany should be split up in 2 or more price zones, basically leading to a further fragmentation, even within Germany. So I think the benefits of competition, having an integrated markets with respect to innovation, but also consumer protection, are important. So it's very important that the European Commission basically looks into these things. The reasons for the disintegration or the increasing fragmentation of markets, I think, are manifold. There's not one single reason. There are a number of reasons. The debate about capacity mechanisms at the national level may be more a reflection of the fragmentation than a cause. So it may be a sign that markets are not integrated enough. I think the 2 main reasons really for the fragmentation are, first, the very different approaches that the member states have taken to support renewable energies. I think almost all countries have set up their own renewable support scheme without thinking about consequences for their neighboring states. So in terms of economics, we would call that externalities that have been created by one policy that was followed in one country, not thinking about what that means for the neighboring countries, really. And for example, if you look at the price equality between Germany and the Netherlands, we saw a huge increase in price equality in 2011. It was more or less more than 80% of all hours we had equal prices. And since then, that has been drastically declining pricing equality between these 2 countries. And mostly, we see situations in more than 99% of all times, prices are lower in Germany when the price is not the same as in the Netherlands than in the Netherlands. It means the German producers sort of basically cannot ship or send electricity, transmit electricity to the Netherlands, while it's not a problem the other way around. When the price tends to be higher in Germany and it's cheaper to produce in the Netherlands, the borders are always open. So we have a very asymmetric market integration at the moment. And that has to do, of course, with a lot of wind that is produced in northern Germany and the lack of border capacity between these 2 countries, especially from Germany into the Netherlands, with all the consequences for the producers. And obviously, I would think this is something that comes close to having a significant impact, or at least a measurable impact, on competition, and something that would be very valuable to look into. So I think this is it would be very nice to have a sector inquiry into renewable energies or support schemes of renewable energies, as well as on top of the sector inquiry into capacity markets. The second most quite obvious reason for sort of the lack of market integration is, of course, the lack of network of border capacity, transmission capacity. If we had just sufficient capacity, then basically all the different policies would wash out in prices being transmitted all across the European Union. With respect to capacity mechanisms, so as a consequence, it seems that now many countries, you said at least half of them, have already installed capacity mechanisms or are actively thinking about capacity mechanisms. And there is, I would think, undecided debate in economics whether there is a market failure or whether there isn't a market failure. In theory, as you know, You can construct everything in economics. So you can construct market failures, and you can make the argument that there's no market failure. The question, of course, what is the most plausible scenario? What is the most realistic one? First of all, that firms don't invest into generation in times of high overcapacity is not a sign of market failure. That's a sign of the market working properly. Yeah, because in times of high overcapacity, you don't want anybody to invest even further, whether it's in electricity generation capacity or in container shipping or anything else. In times of high overcapacity, you don't want to invest. And in Germany, we had high overcapacities for quite a while. That was our analysis that we conducted in the Monopolies Commission, even at least until some years ago. So it was good that there was no further investment at this point. The second question, then, of course, as well, but that you can construct scenarios, especially if demand is very inelastic. Yeah, if consumers or electricity users don't react to prices in a proper manner, then, of course, there may be situations where demand and supply do not meet, basically, in the marketplace, and we could have a blackout. And then the question, but something that is often forgotten, I think, is that the elasticity of demand is nothing that falls from heaven, basically. It's not exogenous in economic terms, it's endogenous. It depends on the incentives that you provide to electricity users to think about being flexible. And one concern I have about capacity mechanisms is if you put too much emphasis on installing more and more electricity generation capacity, you basically fortify the problem that demand will remain inelastic, because then there's very little incentive to become elastic in the sense to react to variations in electricity prices. So the question is, what can we do if we possibly need capacity mechanisms but don't want to perpetuate the problem and keep demand inelastic? And I think here you have to think from the very first day about demand response models. How can we integrate electricity users into the capacity markets and not put all the emphasis on electricity generation? Because in the long term, the problem will disappear if demand is only sufficiently elastic. So the second problem that we should think about when thinking about capacity markets is that while there might be a market failure, it's almost certain that there's also regulatory failure. I think it's very difficult to compare all the very many capacity markets all around the world. The only thing that all capacity markets in the world have in common is that they are not stable. They change all the time. Yeah? If you look at the PGM market or whatever market you look at, yeah, they are changed all the time. So if we think about, well, we want to provide stable framework in order to incentivize investment, then you don't want to change it all the time. But of course, if you know that there's a new pot of gold hanging somewhere, then people will be very interested in having in participating, and a lot of new game of strategy starts where those who are not participating yet find very good arguments why they should also participate in the market. So if we think about capacity markets, we should not only talk about market failure, but also about the risk, yeah, about regulatory failure that will emerge as a consequence of installing capacity mechanisms. And of course, and that is something you already said, we should think about network expansion as a complementary measure. Maybe two more words on capacity mechanisms. If we install capacity mechanisms, if it's unavoidable because the realities are as they are, then I think we should at least try to make an effort to not install them at the national level, but think about the regional or supranational level. We conducted some analysis some time ago. Peak demand in Europe is quite different. There's not one European electricity demand. Quite often when there's peak demand in Germany, there's not peak demand in France. And the Monopolies Commission in its last report, which I didn't share anymore, which just happened, was published I think 2 months ago, found that if you look at the 10% of all hours per year and define them as peak demand, the 10% with the highest demand, and compare these across countries, you will find that often more than half of these hours differ between countries. That means when there's peak demand in one country, there's not peak demand in your neighboring country. And that means with network expansion, we can solve already some of the problems without having additional capacity in all the different countries. Also, the second lecture should be include demand response mechanisms, because it addresses the problem in the long term. And if you only look at the generation stage, you tend to perpetuate the problem. So whatever comes out of the sector inquiry that the Commission currently conducts, I think in terms of policy recommendations, two things could be thought about, at least. If we think that particular capacity mechanisms are in line with state aid guidelines, at least one could ask countries to have mandatory measures that complement capacity mechanisms, namely network expansion and demand response being integrated in capacity mechanisms, because that will help to overcome the potential problem, if it exists, in the longer term. That's my remarks for now.
Thank you, Justus. I will add one thought from my side. You, Commissioner, mentioned that the EU should somehow show the instruments for decarbonization also to the rest of the world, and that markets are one brilliant instrument to make decarbonization cheaper, so that if we develop these right instruments, that might be something we can export and help others with that. My question to you would essentially be, if we talk about competition policy, we can talk about the short-term and the long-term market. And my impression in the past was that DG Competition focused a lot on short-term markets. Also, DG Energy focused a lot on short-term markets, on making dispatch better, on making sure that prices between countries are better correlated, and all those nice things, which, to be frank, I think Carlos can calculate on his C64 at home what the best dispatch of the European electricity market should be. For me, the more interesting and more important question to bring down the cost is about investment. And we talked about capacity mechanisms, but it's more than that. In investment in European electricity sectors, in my view, markets play virtually no role anymore. Market signals are without any importance. In each member state, you have a market design set up that is supposed to deliver a certain politically decided fuel mix. Typically, you get overinvestment in those things. You might get some spillovers because you cannot really order at a certain type of power plant, but you essentially do some backseat driving with a market design that at the same time gets you something that you want and something that you don't want. And we see that in all countries. One country to the south of us is putting up one technology, an island over there is putting up another technology, and a country to the east of us is focusing on again other technologies. Each of them call it a market, but it essentially is not. Is DG Competition looking into that, or is it something that more DG Energy should look into?
Well, not only am I outnumbered, I'm also outcompetented, if there is such a word. Probably isn't. But just a few thoughts. The thing is that if this is ever to succeed, we cannot say that some other GG has to look at it. We need to work together. And I hope that you can see that in the strategy for the energy union under the leadership of Vice President Šefčovič. I think that we have put together a very coherent perspective to try to make short-term and long-term come together. And then we're lining up a couple of motives for working for energy union, some be leaning very much to security in terms of international security, some leaning more to security of supply, some leaning more to enabling a transition of the economy to be more sustainable. And then it is for anyone to choose sort of, what do I like the most? What is the most important most is for me? For us, as long as it's working into the direction of enabling energy union, it's fine. And one of the takeaways, hopefully, of the sector inquiry should be relevant for DG Ener, to be an input for the preparation of their legislative drafting when it comes to market design, because I think that any kind of legislation is better if it's well informed. And as I said, and as you also said, Justus, the thing with the capacity mechanism so far is that there is such a variety that it's very, very difficult to get a complete overview. Also to see where you find the negative side effects. Because as a matter of theory or principle, capacity mechanisms are working against energy union because they are national in their principal capacity and where energy union basically is pan-European. And therefore, the more that we can do to make sure that if you really have a need for a capacity mechanism, that it is aligned with energy union perspectives. It is a very, very long road that we have ahead of us because for consumers, being large or small, it can be very difficult to see the cost price of electricity because of taxation on top of it. It can be very, very tricky to react on pricing signals. That being said, it is important to have stronger price signals because otherwise we'll never be able to have demand as part of the pie. And already in the guidelines being very broad, yes, but still it says that if you can convince everyone that you need a capacity mechanism, and that be an open question in the beginning, because you may not need it, because your neighbor may be able to produce sufficiently amounts of energy, then you should enable one in an open tender. It should be technology neutral, and it should have demand response as part of the basic thinking. I know it is unforgivable now, but electricity not produced is the cheapest kind of electricity, and it doesn't pollute. There we go. And yet it is innovation to say it over and over and over again, because it seems to slip everyone's mind that you can agree with people not to demand, and in that you can better control your supply. And if we can enable that, that would be large steps forward in making the markets work better. I think that with the workings with DG Ener, with DG Competition, within the framework of the Energy Union, we can combine short and long-term perspectives. And I think it is very important that we get all actors on board in order to enable a system which has the right signaling. Because in a number of areas, this is not strongly market-related. There is a number of asymmetries, and it can be very difficult to react on market signals because they are obviously, since we in a number of years have relied on administratively set prices, somewhat disturbed. But I don't think that should take away the ambition to try to make the market work in our direction, because the market is a very, very good servant in enabling prices to be more accurate than otherwise, and therefore also to see through where you have a market failure and where you have a regulatory failure. And being in a commission which is working with regulation with the Council and the Parliament to a large degree, of course, to find regulatory failure keeps us busy.
Yeah, thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. I have basically a short comment and a question. The short comment is something you mentioned en passant, that the EU is leading the debate to Paris, and I just want to mention that in my reading, actually, the US and China have been doing a tremendous amount of work ahead of Paris, and I think we may very well risk to fall behind in terms of leadership on fighting climate change. Now, my question is more specifically on the point you made that we need an even-handed approach and ideally, a single price signal for carbon. I mean, which is sort of what every economist agrees to. Now, this has to be true ideally on the global level, because decarbonization is a global problem. So we want at the global level ideally a price for carbon, because if we just get a certain price in the EU, I mean, economic activity will shift unless we are ready to consider, border carbon taxes and these kind of things. So I guess my question to you as a competition commissioner is, suppose we don't get a deal in Paris and major polluters in the world will just say, we continue to pollute as ever before. This will put us at a competitive disadvantage towards those economies. What are the implications from a competition policy point of view for you? I mean, concretely, I mean, do we give exemptions to some European industry then, so that they can compete globally, or do we introduce border carbon taxes, or what is the best approach to solve that global problem?
Well, one of the things that I have learned is not to answer hypothetical questions. And that's why you have work to do, because that is for analysis to put up hypotheses and scenarios and make us all wonder. And I think that's a very, very good division of labor.
David Abiago, journalist from Argus. This is not a hypothetical question. But Šefčovič and Cañete have been really, really clear about the expansion of a certain gas pipeline in the north of Europe, Nord Stream 2. They've detailed the security of supply concerns. I was wondering, what kind of concerns might one have with a sort of similar large project in the north of Europe if it were to be expanded by an external supplier of gas, Gazprom? What kind of competition concerns are there? Is this just a matter for the internal energy market, or is this something for you? And the second question is a small one. So we had scandals on interest rates. I think we had it on the foreign exchanges as well, and a few other products. We also had it in oil and biofuels. I think that you had investigations in May 2013. Was it BP, Statoil, and that? And then since then, it's gone really, really quiet. So does that mean that we can be really safe and think our oil indexes and our, all the energy prices quoted on indexes are completely fine? Or is there something coming there in that specific investigation? Or have somehow the indexes really sort of got down and, they're behaving properly?
Well, the thing is, you know how it is with the antitrust investigations. When there is no news, there is no news. And so far, as you said, there's been a number of incidents where DG Comp and the Commission looked into this in the past. And for now, our work is directed in other areas. But I don't think, unfortunately, that you can be absolutely safe if only the Commission is not having an investigation. It's a large world and there are evil people out there. So rest alert. Just to say that for our side, no present concerns. When it comes to Nord Stream and the other plans, well, so far Šefčovič and Cañete are in the lead to that, and we have no sort of competition portfolio approach to that at the minute.
I will give the floor to Mark, but I would like us to kind of focus a bit on what has been said on the panel to not completely divert in all sorts of directions.
Georg, thank you. That's exactly where I was going. Mark Johnston from the European Policy Centre. There are two things, at least, that we do agree on. One is, Commissioner, sorry, I should say. Two things we do agree on. One is the level of complexity out there in energy markets and systems. And the second, as you said, more particularly, that there is, quote, some motley crew of state aid capacity payments already existing. I hope the aid inquiry and the market design discussion lead to some kind of harmonisation. There's no common definition in EU law today, so that what you say is a motley crew is a very wide, from short run to long run schemes. I still feel, as I said to you 2 weeks ago, this is a debate captured more by producers than consumers. It might have been better today, for example, to have also consumers on the panel. Just a comment in passing. And last comment, and then two specific questions. In general, at this stage, I would still urge caution. For you and your staff to look at the data. There's not that many member states with significant fluctuating electricity output today. In some, if producers are arresting the debate, in a sense, that's the old end of the industry using the idea of the new to capture rents, at least in some cases around Europe. So the specific questions. The first, just to follow the fun, may or may not be hypothetical. How would, if a member state were to propose capacity payments in order to enable new coal capacity, how would you view that? If you want to clarify, I'd be happy to clarify on that. And secondly, reflecting on the announcement on Friday about the UK, which provided nuclear waste transfer rights at guaranteed prices for new nuclear operators in the UK. If in effect by that decision and also by the Hinkley decision last year, nuclear operators can qualify for long run, if not permanent, subsidies, should those kinds of subsidies also be available to other technologies that also help with climate change, renewable energy in particular? To put it another way, is it consistent for the Commission and others to argue for the integration of renewables when that's not the case for nuclear? Thank you.
Well, it's not just to make it a laughing stock, but usually if a question starts with if, it is a suggestion that it's not something happening right now. And I think one of the things that we're looking at is exactly the point. Do member states produce a sufficient factual foundation when they decide to start planning a capacity mechanism? Because our guidelines may be very broad, but they still say that you should make sure that you need one before you get one. That principle does not apply to my cupboard or the number of shoes, but it is a very good principle, though, that if you need it, you have to make sure that you can show the world that you need it. Because otherwise you shouldn't have it. And one of the reasons why the timing of capacity mechanisms right now it's a little tricky is the fact that for now there is an overcapacity presently in producing electricity. And therefore, as I see it, of course at some distance, it is needed to focus not only at how capacity mechanisms are constructed or thought to be constructed, but also the need of capacity mechanisms in themselves. Talking about the data of fluctuation and what can actually happen. In Denmark, where I know it a little bit more, I think now 50% of the electricity is generated by renewables, and the security of supply is at the same level as it has been for decades, which is an extremely high level. So, of course, Denmark has the size of a lab. I realize that, of course. But sometimes when things is doable in a lab, it is also doable in a large scale. So that is one of the things that we focus on when we do the sector inquiry, not only how are the mechanisms set up, but also what is the background for the mechanisms. When it comes to nuclear, I have only read up on the case because it was decided of the previous commission. But what they were doing was basically to focus on one point, which was to prevent overcompensation. I'm not to judge if they were successful in doing that, also because, as it seems right now, the decision will be challenged in court. So we'll see to that eventually. But I do think that it should be an ambition to have a more and more technology-neutral approach when it comes to subsidies, also because of the consumer angle. I think the consumer taxpayer angle may be more or less the same in this situation. Of course, it's not completely the same, but it is an important issue because taxpayers' money should be well spent, if spent, when it comes to energy subsidies.
Only shortly, I think the Commissioner is also there for defending the consumers, so therefore maybe we have consumers here. I would have a short question to Justus and the Commissioner on, again, capacity mechanisms, which is, you are talking about there might be a problem with capped electricity prices that lead to the necessity to have some other remuneration for investments. On the other hand, we are talking about mitigation of market power for the generators, and sometimes it's a very fuzzy concept where you say that what is market power of a producer that is only allowed to produce every 10 years once for several hours. How high a price is he allowed to set? Because that will depend. Or on that, it will depend whether he has an incentive to invest or not. So there is a strong interlinkage between what competition policy can do also to prevent the need for capacity mechanisms by making the energy-only market work. Maybe, Justus, you have a sounded.
Yeah, I didn't really talk a lot about this, but of course some of the problems, as you mentioned, of capacity mechanisms or the need for capacity mechanisms is homemade in the sense that if you cap electricity prices in the first place, then of course some investments that would otherwise pay off are not paying off. So I think the guidelines also are quite explicitly that a price cap is not the state aid guidelines. A price cap is not an excuse or is not a it's not a market failure. Basically, that's more a regulatory failure. So a price cap cannot be used as an excuse to install a capacity mechanism. Of course, there's a vivid debate whether it's sustainable from a political point of view to maintain a situation without price caps. I mean, the German government, as you may have followed, it's trying to do that in its new electricity market law, trying to be much more explicit. Say, we want to guarantee as much as we can that we won't intervene into the functioning of the markets, even when we see price spikes. We haven't seen price spikes for a very long time. We had, I think, the highest price ever paid in Germany was 2,400 euros in 2007. But we are very, very, and that was apparently sustainable. Nobody called for price caps at that time. But we haven't seen the price volatility has decreased enormously. Yeah, we don't see really high. We haven't seen high prices for very long. I think last year the highest price was something 80 something, something. So very, very low price. So we are far away from needing price caps. In theory, you are right. If we are in a situation where really demand just exactly meets capacity and it's inelastic, then we have a huge degree of market power. But then again, my hope is still that if sort of we let the electricity market work, or also include demand models, then demand will not be that inelastic in the very end anymore. And we can also, and the market then should basically react to price spikes by reducing demand or storage, possibly in the very long future.
But no need for a commitment from competition policy to not intervene.
I think it's good to have a commitment not to intervene, unless there are signs of sort of long-lasting abuse of market power. not a sort of non-temporary, I would say.
No, just one remark on top of what Justus said, which is what you yourself alluded to later on, the need for investment. Because to have a demand elasticity and flexibility, well, you need investment also in enabling that. Because you need technology to enable also households to be much more responsive to fluctuations in prices. So you need investment both large scale in grids and cables, interconnectors, what have you, but you also need small scale investment in smart meters and what have we in order to enable a proper demand response. Because when you add up, well, then the household consumption is also a very important element in how the market is working. And that takes a lot of investment over the coming years to enable that.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Georg. Wolfgang Weber from BASF. Certainly, Commissioner, you cannot be envied for the situation in which you are. We have, I think, many trade-offs. Huh? So one trade-off is between the national energy mix decision that you quoted out from yourself, and then the more the EU competence in your case to try to get an internal market running. The same would be then true for something like the national climate targets. Now, Germany has introduced separate climate targets, which are much more ambitious than the EU ones, which lead to further problems. So basically, my question would be, what can you do? What do you plan to do to give the internal market priority? So, for example, if you think about now, of course, you will not disclose details, I guess, but for the lignite subsidy situation in Germany, to put this into reserve, how will you approach your decision on that one? How will you make sure that others that also have lignite can also be part of that scheme that Germany is about to set up? Or likewise, why could not you in the past make sure that the renewable subsidies are more open to other member states as well, to make it less hypothetical and more concrete, because this was already in the past? Likewise, now Guntram discussed the global picture, and then you said, well, this hypothetical. Also there, to make it less hypothetical, it was the Commission who said that indeed electricity prices in Europe are roughly on the average twice as high as in other competing markets, and gas prices just 3 times higher. So this is not hypothetical, but this is reality. How will your services, DG Competition, take those things into account when you think about certain principles to alleviate costs for consumers? Thanks.
Yes, thank you. Vincent Verhouden, EC Economics. I've got a specific question on the capacity mechanisms and the inquiry that you are undertaking at the moment. It covers 11 countries at present. Known ones as Belgium, Germany, Ireland, etc. Just for a better understanding, what led you to select precisely those countries and leave apart the other ones? Was that a matter of, let's say, the lack of data, as Mr. Carlos Alonso already referred to, like here is little data, let's go there? Or does it signal something more, like, well, perhaps there's indeed more problematic things to look at? And then related to that precisely, in the list, the UK is missing. Now, of course, there has been a fairly recent decision, we're talking 1 year ago, now about, let's say, the Commission approving a state aid scheme for a UK capacity mechanism, which actually, I understand, is now subject to legal challenge in Luxembourg in relation to a complainant who said, well, there's not enough space for demand-side measures. I've got demand-side flexibility to offer. A auction is organized, but I can't take part in a sufficiently good manner. I'm not part of this proceeding or this case at all, but it's just an observation. So let's say a prima facie, let's say a legal challenge signals some issue, perhaps. So the question would be, if you're able to answer at least, why is the UK, for instance, not part of this list of countries that is being investigated or being looked into for facts finding, I should probably say, in this context. Thank you.
Well, I think you're right in saying that it's a difficult task, and therefore, of course, it's very, very important that we are many to solve it. And obviously, we cannot have an energy union without the member states on board. It is not for the Commission to fulfill this alone. And therefore, both the support of heads of state in the summits, but also in the workings of the national energy policies to get those aligned. I think there's a lot of work to do. I'm not at all suggesting that this will be easy. I'm just suggesting that it will be good if we eventually get there. But also that it will be a very bumpy road. Also because there are probably a lot of wasted interests as well. Guarantees, investment that are still not fully matured. So a lot of things will happen over the coming years, and probably there will be a number of problems on the way. But still, I think that we can step by step get there, and for me, rather quick steps than a slow fox. But I think it is a step-by-step approach because you need to align so many different actors. On the lignite situation, I will discuss that with Germany. And of course, I would be happy to respond also on behalf of my predecessors, but I think it is very difficult to say that why systems were not constructed in a different way in the past when they have been approved and put in practice. On the 11 countries, we try to find a variety of capacity mechanisms and a variety of history of the capacity mechanisms put in place. Most of them has a very short history. A lot of them put in place has not been used because that winter there wasn't any use and the next winter neither. there is no specific reason for the UK not being there, and we are being very precise to say that we are not investigating the 11 member states. We're asking questions, and we ask questions to a variety of shareholders in each member state, in order to get a full picture. And already so far, we can see that we have a picture where the answers to the questionnaires complement each other. They don't necessarily say exactly the same thing, which I think is very good. So probably we'll be wiser by the end of it, but we will be cautious, because you are right to put focus on the fact that in some of these areas, also due to the complexities, we need more data, and one should be very cautious not to generalize where data is not sufficient to do so. I'm also a big fan of competition tools, but I think that they have limits. Competition cannot solve everything, every problem that we have ahead of us, but it can complement the approach, and it can complement also in deciding where to use competition and where to use regulation, so that you don't always have the default position of regulating things. And I try to do a strong advocacy for using competition more, because I think too often you rely on regulation to do the trick, without ever testing if there is a market, if there can be a market, if you can use the forces of competition instead of the forces of regulation. But I definitely think that it is very important to make sure what you're dealing with. And that was why I tried to put in or to underline that it's mature technologies where you could use auctions or public tender, because you will have very new technologies who cannot thrive in a public tender because they're not there yet. They're not at all ready. And therefore you would have a different approach in order to enable innovation and to enable new technologies to be tested, in order to eventually get into a scheme and eventually, hopefully, to mature and to complement other technologies. And I think it's very important to be aware of that. The thing is that basically when we talk about waste, it is, in my opinion, a very big global market failure. Because the idea that we can just throw away resources, as we do and has done for hundreds of years, is basically a huge market failure. You see in other societies where resources are more scarce, you don't have a market failure to the same degree, because people are forced to use things in a completely different manner. But I don't think that such a market failure of this degree should then say, well, then let's monopolize things in the beginning. I think you should enable people to find new ways, as they do in the sharing economy, and then with an open mind try to find answers to the questions then raised about taxation and labor conditions and security and what have we, when it comes to the part of the sharing economy that has real volume. But in that, I think, well, competition is part of the solution, but no matter how much I like it, it's not the full answer.
Last round of two questions.
No.
Maria?
Yes. Well, thank you, Commissioner, for your vibrant speech for competition and the strong support for the market. Now, having said this, I work for Fortum, the Finnish power company. I mean, in the Nordic market, as you know, certainly better than me, the average price is quite low at the moment. So certainly there is a lot of support for a market approach, that renewable is developed with market at the core and not against the market. But what we see at the moment is that I think the renewable policies to a large extent have also led to build more than what is actually needed. And this is also something that has an impact on the price, on the wholesale price. And is it something that is, again, maybe I would refer to the question of Georg, is it more an energy policy issue or is it a competition issue? Because you can do a lot in terms of integrating renewable into the market, making the renewable scheme more compensatory. But if we continue to build more than what we need, it makes the whole market much more difficult to work.
Patrick Loris from the Elia Group. I'm wondering if you could maybe give me your views on Acer's recommendation that the Austrian-German market should be split. Because I kind of feel sorry for the Austrians. You know, you tell us that their garbage collection bills are going to go down, but that's going to be offset by a raise in electricity prices, so they're going to be paying more for electricity.
And I would add a last one-number question to all of the panelists. In 10 years, what do you think? Will we have an electricity market that is done by national administrative, or sees its investments done by national administrative schemes, by EU administrative schemes, national markets, or more EU markets, or given probabilities?
Well, I think the question on whether or not the schemes has been too generous, I think it's very difficult for me to answer. I think to some degree it's in the interrelationship between the regulation from DG Ener and a competition law approach that answers can be found. But a lot of issues are basically not for competition law because it comes from directives or regulation within the environment and energy field. And in that, it is of course difficult for us to do something. On the Acer recommendation, I have no comments whatsoever. It's not for me. Where we are in 10 years' time from now, well, I think it actually does not depend on this commission, because if you were at the college meeting where we sit as we're sitting here, I think you would find that there's a lot of energy to reach out for the creation of an energy union. But there is also a lot of respect for the fact that we need a lot of actors on board. That be business, that be research, innovation, analysis, and that be governments, but that also be cities. And cities play a different role in our democratic systems. And therefore, of course, we also wonder how can we get the cities on board. We haven't talked about heating yet, which is, of course, an important element as well. And here cities come in very strongly. How cities organize themselves, because a lot of these interesting investments will be on city level in some of the larger cities in Europe. And to bring all that together, I think if you can calculate the probability of doing that, if there's a high probability of bringing everyone on board, well, then there is a very high probability that we will have a European market in 10 years. But if actors are doing their own thing, then they will sub-optimize, and then the markets will still be very national also in 10 years from now.
I don't know what it looks like in 10 years. Economists are notoriously good at predictions, as you all know. But my hope would be that we have, first of all, a more integrated approach to climate policy, something that Guntram Wolf also mentioned, carbon price that guides decisions also between sectors, something that Carlos mentioned, for example, in the traffic sector as well. And let's basically make us smart decisions where carbon can be saved in the most cost-efficient manner, and also in the end a more European approach to energy policy than something that we see right now. At the moment, for example, we have 5 times the solar capacity in Germany when compared to Spain. And while you all know that when the sun is shining, there's a lot of solar capacity, the reverse causality doesn't necessarily hold. So I think there's some room for improvement, and where huge efficiency gains can be made so that ecological objectives and economic objectives really go hand in hand there.
Then it stays with me to thank the panelists and Mrs. Vestager for her very interesting presentation. I really learned a lot on what competition policy can and what should it do for the energy transition, so that it's not kind of something completely detached, orthogonal to competition policy and energy transition, that the two things work together. Following up on the last remarks on the long term. In 2 weeks, which is not very long term, we'll hold a discussion on decarbonization in the framework of the Paris discussion, so economics of decarbonization with Ottmar Edenhofer from PIC, who is in chair of the IPCC, and with Simone Mori from NL and Justel Baker. So would be happy to see you all again here. Thanks a lot.